What does it really mean to be insane in the eyes of the law? You know, it's a question that stretches our entire justice system to its breaking point. Today, we're going to unpack that exact idea, all through a really dramatic and tragic case from 1998 that forces us to ask some pretty tough questions. So let's dive right in.
Okay, let's go back in time. The date is November 19, 1998. We're in Catbalogan, Samar, and what started out as just another Thursday night was about to spiral into absolute chaos, leaving 2 men dead and an entire community just completely shaken.
The violence was just incredibly swift and brutal. First, at 6:30 p.m., a young guy named Alan Dackles is just chilling on a bench when out of nowhere he's attacked. Witnesses saw a man with long hair just stab him over and over. Then, a little more than an hour later, at 7:45 p.m., a man named Demetrio Petronio Jr. gets ambushed on a highway nearby. He suffers the exact same terrible fate.
Now, in both of these horrific attacks, witnesses all pointed to the same guy, a man named Opuran. He was arrested later that same night, and right there the stage was set for a really complex legal fight.
So when Opuran was finally brought to trial, his defense team didn't just deny the charges. Nope, they took a turn that would pretty much define the entire case.
And this is where the strategy gets fascinating, right? At first, Opuran's story was super simple. It was an alibi. He said, I was home, I was asleep, wasn't me. But then, as the trial went on, that entire defense got thrown out the window. The new argument? That he was legally insane, that he was suffering from a psychotic disorder when the killings happened.
Well, that sudden switch raised some serious red flags for the court. See, an insanity plea is what's called a confession and avoidance defense. You're basically admitting, yes, I did the act, but you're arguing you shouldn't be held criminally responsible. So for the court, switching from, I didn't do it, to, okay, I did it, but I was insane, looked incredibly suspicious, like the insanity claim was just a last-ditch effort, an afterthought.
So because of that, the entire case now balanced on one single critical question. And believe me, the answer is way more complicated than you might think.
You know, in everyday conversation, we throw the word insane around to describe all kinds of weird behavior. But in a court of law, it has a very specific and honestly a very high bar. Just having a medical diagnosis for a mental illness, that's not going to be enough, not even close.
To really get what the court was thinking, you have to know about the Formigone standard. This standard says it's not enough to just have a mental disorder. The defense has to prove a complete deprivation of intelligence when the crime was happening. The person had to be so out of it that they acted without any understanding whatsoever. It's an incredibly high standard to meet.
So, how does that actually play out? Well, it boils down to 2 tests, and the court really focuses on the first one, the test of cognition. The big questions are, did the accused have any idea what they were doing? And, the most important question of all, did they know that what they were doing was wrong? The other test, the test of volition, whether they could control their actions, is secondary. The main thing is, did they understand?
And here's the real kicker. In a normal trial, the prosecution has to prove you're guilty. But when the defense claims insanity, the whole script flips. The burden of proof is now on them. It was up to Opuran's legal team to prove with clear and convincing evidence that he met that ridiculously high standard of legal insanity.
So yeah, the defense had a massive mountain to climb. Let's take a look at the actual evidence they brought to the table to try and prove their case.
The defense basically built their case on 3 main points. First, they had a psychiatrist who diagnosed Opuran with schizophrenia and said he was psychotic when the crimes happened. Second, they brought up witnesses who remembered him acting strangely, like wearing formal clothes for no reason. And third, his own siblings testified that he had a history of mental health problems, that he talked to himself, and that he'd gotten some treatment way back in the 80s.
But the court was just not convinced, and their whole line of reasoning really comes down to this one simple but powerful idea. A man may act crazy, but it does not necessarily and conclusively prove that he is legally so. That quote just perfectly captures the huge gap between seeming mentally ill and actually meeting the legal definition of insanity.
So the court just systematically picked the defense's evidence apart. That expert testimony? They said it was weak, based on just a few short interviews that happened almost 2 years after the crime. And that's critical, because the law demands you prove insanity at the exact moment the act is committed, not years later. His past treatment was as an outpatient over a decade ago, and as for the odd behaviors, the court basically called them abnormalities, not proof of a complete break from reality.
So after weighing all of that evidence against that very strict legal standard, the court finally reached its decision.
And the verdict on this was crystal clear. The defense did not meet its burden of proof.
The court found that Anacito Opuran was, in the eyes of the law, sane when he committed the attacks, and because of that, he was criminally responsible for his actions.
So Opuran was found guilty, but the verdicts were actually different for each victim. For the death of Demetrio Petrinio Jr., the conviction was murder, and the sentence was reclusion perpetua, which is pretty much a life sentence. The court found treachery because the evidence showed Opuran hid and ambushed him, giving him zero chance to fight back. But for Alan Dackels, the conviction was for the lesser crime of homicide. Why? Because no one actually saw the attack begin, so legally, treachery couldn't be proven.
The case of Anacito Opuran really forces us to look at an incredibly difficult question. It shows us that the legal system, by its very nature, has to draw a hard, clear line, even when it's dealing with the messy, complicated reality of the human mind. And it kind of leaves you wondering, is that line in the right place?